A very warm welcome to our event today on a European response to the coronavirus. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm the director of Bruegel, and this event is a co-organized event with the Financial Times, and Marine Khan, who is a correspondent here in Brussels, is also joining this call. We are both extremely pleased to welcome today Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni, who has also been, of course, former Prime Minister of Italy, and he is the European Commissioner responsible for the European economy. And of course, a lot of things are currently happening in the European economy. So Commissioner Gentiloni has been very, very busy these last weeks, and of course is preparing the Eurogroup meeting and the Commission's contribution to the Eurogroup meeting tomorrow, where EU finance ministers and Eurozone finance ministers are tasked to discuss the European response, the fiscal response to this unprecedented slowdown of Europe's economy since World War II. Commissioner Gentiloni, let me perhaps start to ask you a general question. I mean, we've heard a lot of talk about all kinds of instruments, a 4-pillar strategy, 3-pillar strategies being discussed with the ESM, the EIB, and the unemployment insurance scheme very much in the discussion. And you yourself, with your colleague, Mr. Breton, have advocated a major fiscal response yesterday in Le Monde, the French periodical. So tell me, is the 3 pillars that are being discussed, is that what we are going to see at the Eurogroup, and do you think it's enough?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. Thank you for this meeting. What I would expect firstly from the Eurogroup, and I'm rather confident that they will get there, is a message of shared unity, because I think that it is not the moment for divisions, and if we share what you just said, that this is really an unprecedented crisis, we need to start with 2 very clear ideas. One is that from this unprecedented crisis, you will not come out from this crisis with winners and losers. So among European member states, either we succeed as a European Union or we fail. We can't imagine this symmetric crisis to have 2 huge asymmetric consequences in single member states, because this would put at stake the very existence of our union. Second point is that the strength of a common reaction should be reinforced as far as we can. This is not to say that until now we didn't take important measures. I'm quite satisfied of the measures that were taken by so to say, European institutions, from the ECB to the European Commission. But we have to say that we need more. So the Eurogroup will be, I think, a good message if it agrees on a common response, and if this common response is ambitious.
Commissioner, if I could just jump in to follow up on that point about what the Eurogroup will do. You've already suggested things that go beyond this Eurogroup, that go beyond perhaps the next few weeks in your new sort of post-crisis investment fund. Is there a danger that by proposing even more, the suggestion is that whatever 3-pronged strategy involving SURE, involving the EIB, involving other types of guarantees, is already seeming to be insufficient?
No, I don't think so. I think, but I understand your point, obviously. I think that we should be very careful, and I know that this could appear a little bit boring or pedagogic, so to say, always to remember what has been done until now. So, because also to discuss of measures involving ESM or other institution could be seen as an assessment judging not sufficient what the ECB decided at middle of March. I think that the ECB decision was very, very strong one, very positive one, and the fact that we are discussing further measures should in no way undermine or make weaker the assessment on these measures. And this is the same for a common fiscal response. We are now converging in some measures, but we have to be clear on the fact that stronger fiscal common response is needed if we want to avoid this asymmetry in the consequences of this symmetric crisis.
So can I ask you a bit more on the fiscal responses we have seen so far? I mean, all member states have acted and have acted decisively. However, if you look at the numbers, they differ quite strongly across countries. And I noted that the German fiscal response is actually very, very significant, while the Italian one seems to be relatively small compared to the German one, even though the health crisis in Italy is not only deeper but already more advanced. How do you explain this relatively weak response in Italy to date? Are you encouraging the Italian authorities to do more fiscally, to borrow more, which is sort of against almost the DNA of the Commission? That is supposed to look after fiscal discipline. But I think in these current circumstances, at least in my view, acting and doing more is actually even going to be helpful for long-term debt sustainability. And so it would be a mistake not to do more. And I think the message should really be do more to safeguard the companies and the really the engine of the economy. So what's the Commission communication vis-a-vis Italy, but also Spain and countries that are very strongly affected by this crisis at this stage?
Yes, you are right. Responses until now were rather quick, but they are already different country by country, and it could appear unusual, but it is true that the Commission now is sending the message that it is absolutely necessary to give a strong and quick response. What was decided until now, more or less 3.2, 3.3% of the EU 27 GDP in measures, I mean expenditures and tax relief. And then on the other aspect, which is the liquidity guarantees and tax postponement, a bigger amount of GDP, very higher, and something like 2.3 trillion of liquidity. But as you said, this is not symmetric. So I think this can have also a different wave of explanation. For example, Italy, that I know very well, probably had also, the reason is also on the fact that Italy reacted first, being affected by the outbreak before other countries, and so now they are studying a second time of intervention. But it is not only this, it is also the different situation of these countries. And this is one of the reasons why we need common fiscal tools, because we can't imagine that not only on the sovereign debt issue, but also on real economy, we can't imagine that this crisis could enlarge the divergence among the euro area, especially the euro area economies, because this would be very, very dangerous. So the role of common tools is to rebalance the risk of augmenting divergence and the political consequences of augmenting divergence in this so difficult moment.
Maybe if I can jump in and with a view to the questions, because the word corona bonds is coming up, and Samuel Kenny wants to know where you foresee the debate about corona bonds tomorrow. And it seems like in the last few days, the Commission has definitely been backing away from at least using the term corona bonds, but still talking about ideas of common borrowing and common fiscal capacity. Despite your, I think, reticence to keep using the word, we saw that Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, wrote an op-ed over the weekend, still pushing this idea. We've seen, I guess, some unexpected corners of the German political spectrum also asking Berlin to embrace the idea of corona bonds. So where does the Commission really sit? Do you still want to stop using the C word as much as possible?
Well, I'm not in love with labels in this moment. What I'm always saying is let's try to connect as strictly as possible missions to emissions, because this is the key problem that we have. If we are only discussing on financial tools or even on labeling of financial tools, I don't think we go in the right direction. What is the right direction from my point of view is to define the mission that we have. So for some sectors, the mission has already tools and emissions connected to these tools, at least in limited way, but clear. So facing unemployment risk, we are trying to reinforce national schemes like Kurzarbeit or Cassa Integrazione or Chômage Partiel with this sure mechanism. Liquidity, to avoid that differences in liquidity guarantees contribute to the divergence in real economy I was referring to. This is the task of a strengthened role of the European Investment Bank. For sure, it's still limited, as limited is the mechanism of SURE, but they are clearly there, and I think they will give good contribution. Then there is the discussion on these ESM enhanced credit lines, on their conditionalities, and this is also answering to a clear mission. Then we have the mission, so to say, of relaunching our economy, of recovery. And here, I think a strong fiscal effort is needed. How to build this strong fiscal effort? For sure, we will go to the market and borrow money because nobody has reserves to use for this. Who will do this? Which institution? It is an open debate. But from my point of view, what is crucial is to build gradually the awareness and the consensus on the fact that this should have also not only national contribution, but also a European contribution on single strategic programs that we have to finance. And second point that should be clear is that this common tool should be in place soon. There is, as we all know, frequently reference to George Marshall and the plan that he presented after the war. But I just want to remember to all of us that we don't have 2 years. The Marshall Plan was presented in 1947. We need a Marshall Plan, so to say, one homemade, made in Europe and not coming from outside. And second, it should be launched in 1945, not in 1947, because the relaunch and the convergence, if possible, of the European economy needs to be addressed in the next weeks and months, not in the next years.
Well, I mean, I think we very much agree that there needs to be a very big fiscal response. And I think we've sketched the national responses, but I think the discussion on the European level response is still, as you say, very much ongoing. Now, you emphasize that there's really a need for working together and having some common response, fiscal response. Now, when I talk to some of my compatriots, the reply I get is, well, but the ECB is already there and every country can borrow at low rates. So can you perhaps explain to our listeners, again, why you really think there needs to be a common European response? I mean, why do we need to go beyond getting every country just do more? I mean, you as a commissioner, if you were to encourage every country to just borrow much more than what they do, especially the countries that so far do less, and the ECB is there, do we really need a European level institution such as the ESM or the EIB or a fund or whatever you want to call the mechanism to do the joint borrowing? Or isn't the ECB just acting in the sovereign bond markets enough? That's a question that is often raised to me. I think I probably personally agree with your position, but I think it would be important to hear the argument why we really need a joint fiscal borrowing, a joint mechanism, so that our fiscal response, especially in the south of Europe, is commensurate with the challenge.
Well, just to answer to your question, I think that those the people saying that, why asking themselves, why do we need something else than the ECB? If asked on in another way, do you think that ECB should play a role of fiscal policy? They would answer horrified, no, this is not what the ECB should do in any case. So I think it is not absurd that since not few days, but few years, Mario Draghi and recently Christine Lagarde always were saying that monetary policy need to be joined by a coordinated European fiscal policy. But I think this is not something that we say to undermine or under-evaluate the importance of the decision of the ECB, which is 750 billion plus 120 billion plus 80 billion per month of the previous program. So if you put all this together from now to the end of the year, it's a huge amount of potential intervention in monetary policy. But as was said by the ECB itself in last years, it is clear that we need a coordinated fiscal policy if we want to rebuild our economic system, which will be really in great difficulties after this prolonged lockdown. We need coordinated intervention, I repeat, also to assure a level playing field and avoid the fact that especially in the euro area where we have a single currency, economies goes in two different directions. I think this would be politically very, very dangerous for the Union.
I guess also a related issue that Draghi has mentioned and other people are starting to think about is the post-crisis debt burden. And I think you also mentioned yourself that some of the amounts of the spending are in the 1.5 trillions. I think Klaus Regling has said that at the end of this, we could see an increase in the Eurozone's debt to GDP of 20%. Have you started thinking about the sheer scale and the volume of borrowing that will end up on the balance sheets of governments? And relatedly, then also what happens to this debt? So people, I mean, Draghi mentioned himself that they would basically need mass private write-offs of this debt. Is this part of the political calculation when you speak to member states? When we have sort of already started using the word exit plan, is the exit plan going to have to, at its very, very core, address this issue of debt?
Well, I think that it is too soon to address. I hope that sincerely, I hope that we will be able soon to discuss these issues, because this will mean that we have at least certainty on the evolution of the curve of this outbreak, which is possible, but not yet sure. We all know that we will not have a X hour when the outbreak will finish. It's not, I repeat, it's not like a war when you have a peace treaty and the war is finished. Here we will have a rather long period of when we will live with this virus, but in a limited, hopefully in a limited and manageable way. But we are not yet there, and this is the moment, I think, when at national level the response should be as quick as possible, because we risk to lose entire sectors of our industries, and they can't wait a discussion on what happens in the future. This is the reason also. This is also the reason why we suspended our fiscal rules, the so-called Stability and Growth Pact. It was a message to say, okay, we are in emergency, and the emergency response should be as strong and fast as possible. Then the ECB strength is there to limit consequences in sovereign debt, and a coordinated fiscal response should be there to limit consequences in real economy, try to establish a level playing field in the reconstruction and the relaunch of real economy, which is, I think, strategically extraordinarily important for the future of the Union.
But just to follow up, I understand that maybe the fundamental idea of how to treat debt is maybe too soon. But when you're proposing huge post-crisis investment funds, do you not need to give countries some certainty about how the money they borrow or they ask will be treated once the crisis is over. So perhaps one of the reasons Italy might be more reticent to borrow now is a fear that it will still be saddled with this money long after the crisis is over. So do we not actually just need to grasp this nettle as soon as possible, because it is part of the confidence building exercise?
For sure, when the discussion on how to connect to this recovery mission, also the adequate tools will be more advanced, because it is now going on, this discussion, but as you know, it is still a little bit divisive, and I am using an understatement in telling this. But I also see a step forward in this divisive discussion. Obviously, going on with this discussion, we will have to address to several issues. What kind of institution will provide this common tool? Could be existing institution, could even be the multi-annual financial framework of the Union with adequate changement and adjustment. And in this framework, we should discuss also the maturity of these loans and how the relation between loans and grants, etc., etc. What in this moment is my personal effort is to try to build consensus in a very simple concept. The concept is please avoid in this moment a discussion that is exactly the same that we had in the previous 10 years. I really ask a sort of no regret discussion. We have not to discuss if in the last 10 years this country or this group of countries did the right thing or the wrong thing. They should have been more serious with their debt. They should have used their fiscal space, etc., etc., etc. The risk sharing, the risk reduction, okay. But providing that nobody is proposing the mutualization of the former debt, but we are proposing the, so to say, mutualization of commitments that we have and programs that we have and missions that we have for the next months and years, I think we need a discussion that goes towards the future and not regretting our different opinions in the past 10 years. This discussion is, from my point of view, a negative one if we look at the problems of today with this kind of divisions of the last 10 years.
Well, thank you for this clear answer. And indeed, I think the issue of the long-term debt sustainability shouldn't really be a worry as long as the European Central Bank holds a significant amount of debt on its balance sheet, which I think is desirable actually, and is not inflationary, because basically we are in a situation after depressions like this caused by a pandemic. We tend to be in situations where inflation rates are actually falling and not increasing. So I wouldn't worry much about the ECB holding a significant amount of its debt on its balance sheet. And I think they can be very clear and outright on this. But you mentioned, of course, and I want to ask you a bit more about this, the issue of looking at the past and avoiding a discussion repeating itself, and a discussion we all know too well from the last 10 years around the Eurozone. And I think what I would like to ask you in that respect is that, of course, some countries, some member states would love to see a stronger involvement of the European Stability Mechanism, exactly because the ESM comes along with conditionality, and because those countries think that the conditionality may be exactly what is needed, so as to put countries on a long-term sustainable growth path. So, of course, in your country, the ESM option is very much disliked. And, I get on Twitter messages, no MOS and so on. So I think it's a very polarized debate, yet it seems to be the ESM is still part of the package that's on the table. So what's the Commission's view on this? I mean, should we keep that option on the table, or should we rely more on the unemployment insurance scheme that you are proposing, or how do you see the mix of the instruments going forward?
Well, I think that the ESM tool is absolutely useful in the tool box, in the toolkit that from the Eurogroup should be transferred to the European Council, providing that the discussion that is going on, that I understand is going on with good progress on these so-called conditionalities, get to a good point, because again, let me give you a political reading of this issue. I think we are all aware that what was the use of the ESM mechanism to rescue single countries in the last 10 years is not what we need now. What we need now is to have a common tool for what is obviously a crisis affecting all European countries, and so the whole mechanism of conditionalities should be changed. And I think this process is advanced enough. I understand that in some member states, and in particular in Italy, there is a particular discussion on this subject, but the opinion of the Commission is that if we reach a good agreement on conditionalities, this is one of the instruments that we should use. Obviously, we can't say in this moment to a country affected with such a terrible crisis, okay, now you have to submit to a surveillance program. They will come and tell you what you have to do with your pension scheme and what you have to do with this, with that. This is obviously politically totally impossible. But I know that this is very clear to everybody, including and more than others, Klaus Regling, which is the director of the ESM. So we are trying to use this tool in a completely different way from the one that was during the financial crisis.
Just to follow up, tomorrow's Eurogroup, is the biggest task that you face having to convince Italy that a totally reformed type of ECCL is something they have to accept, or is the harder task to convince the other countries that they have to drop their conventional ideas of conditionality? So which is the biggest block here in this debate? Is it the Italian side, or is it the slightly more frugal side that are still insisting on, having some strings attached?
I am rather optimistic that both this opinion could converge, but I really don't know. It is something that is still under discussion. The key point is the very different approach should establish rules for having access to this ECCL, so to say, once and for all. Once means at a certain point, even before single countries are asking or not asking access to ECCL, and for all means not tailor-made for this country or these other countries on the basis of a surveillance program, etc., but for all means that here is the tool. If Belgium need to access to it or don't want to access to it, it will be a Belgian decision, but the tool is there, and it is there with a previous assessment and established towards all member states. Then we know that some member state will never ask this kind of thing, and I really don't know what Italy should or would or could decide on this, but it is a decision and assessment directed to all member states.
So we
this
have
is the key of the discussion, I think.
So we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I would just like us in the last 8-10 minutes that we have, just perhaps to get some of those discussed. So one question by Thomas Bileski is about the fact that the debate on the common fiscal response is very much focused on the euro area, but what about the non-euro area members? Is there a risk of a non-euro area fragmentation and recovery plans?
Well, we have tools at European level to support non-euro area countries, to support their balance of payments. And it is absolutely true that we should consider this dimension and not only the euro area dimension. But at the same time, I have to repeat and stress the fact that the consequences of divergence inside the euro area are more dangerous because of the fact that we have a single currency. This is obvious, and it is the reason why we have specific tools for the euro area.
Another question we have is about some of the other priorities, which I think maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago were dominating at least the Commission's agenda, and now we don't hear about them so much. And one of the big ones is the Green Deal, and you're one of the biggest advocates of the green finance in the college, at least, and the most vocal. We have a question from Henry Everston at the WWF, who sort of sums up some concern that in this post-crisis investment world, what can the Commission do and what will the Commission do to ensure that things like the Sustainable Development Goals and the idea of the Green Deal is still fundamental? And I guess a related question would be that before this crisis, the Commission was doing a very sensitive exercise about how to study the impact of higher emissions for 2030 on the economy. We now have absolutely no idea about what the state of the economy is going to be in a few months. So in terms of that exercise, setting short-term climate goals, how do you model for something as almost unprecedented and exogenous as this pandemic?
No, thank you for this question, because I think it's very important. I said before, let's try to connect missions to emissions. What kind of missions do we have? First, the healthcare mission. Second, the jobs and employment, etc. Third, liquidity to companies and then banks, etc. But then we have a fourth mission, which is, I think, to incorporate in the very process of transition from the lockdown to the vaccine, so to say, also the right intervention to use this terrible crisis when we will have won the fight for life, to use it for correction of our model of societies, because this is what such a huge crisis could help to do. And what kind of correction do we need? I think first is for sure on the all the initial commitments of the Commission on the Green Deal, the Sustainable Development Goals, because we have to restart our economy with this very clear in mind. And so not at all forgetting our commitment on this. The same goes for innovation and digitization. By the way, we are experiencing this all the time in these horrible days. And third, I would say, more controversial and not easy, we also should define how the stronger role that for sure the public and the state will have in our economies, at least for a certain time in the next months and years, will influence our economies. What kind of capitalism will we have? Will we face some fascination coming from authoritarian capitalism models coming from outside Europe, or even circulating inside Europe? Because this experience could strengthen the attraction of these models. So the relaunch of our economies is not back to the same model, but it is the opportunity of correction, environmental sustainability, innovation and digitization, but also how to preserve our democratic model in a system where the public function will be stronger than it is now.
So Commissioner, you are also the Commissioner responsible for taxation. And so one of the dimensions going forward is also the whole dimension of inequality in our societies, and how do we make sure that the fallout is not only on the poor, but that there's a fair burden sharing in society. And so we have here a question by Todd Buell about the taxation of digital companies, whether you see them as places where there should be more taxation going forward, also because they are less affected than perhaps manufacturing companies by this crisis. But perhaps you can enlarge, I can enlarge that question and also ask you more broadly about what shall the EU do in this reset phase, really, getting a more inclusive society? Should we change the way we tax? Should we be stricter on corporate taxation? How do we go about, or less strict to allow a recovery? So how do you see this recovery phase and the inclusiveness, and especially the digital companies in that phase?
Yes, for sure. Part of this process and of this discussion has been a little bit freezed in these weeks. I remember the G20 ministers and governors of central bank in Riyadh at second half of February, and the discussion was exactly especially on this digital taxation and global minimum taxation for corporates. And in these very days, the first news of the outbreak going from China to Europe were coming. So as you can understand, in since then, in the last, in March, this discussion has been a little bit freezed, but we still have the commitment in July to try to come with a G20 OECD proposal on this digital taxation. We are not yet there. I think that you are right saying that this crisis is probably stressing even more the importance of this tool to be adopted. And who knows, maybe the crisis will help to give a little bit more boost to multilateralism and international cooperation. And this is my hope, but it could be also the contrary, so that in the crisis, the national interest prevails even more than before. What is clear from the European Union point of view is that we need a digital taxation, and we are now working to have it at a global level, which should be the best way to avoid double taxation and other very complicated issues. And we need also a minimal taxation, which is also in discussion at a global level. Formally, I am tasked, if there is not an agreement at the global level, to advance a European proposal for next year. But before this, I think we have to understand where we will be with our economies next year. But the need to have this is not diminished in these terrible weeks. I could even say that it is augmenting.
I think we're very quickly running out of time, but I want to finish on a political point, because you mentioned the idea of preserving Europe's unique democratic DNA through this crisis, and there are already fears that some of the sort of things that have been unleashed by this crisis will become a feeder for populism. And your own country is somewhere that has this sort of acute political warning very obviously there, because of how vocal Mr. Salvini is. Maybe just as a sort of some of your parting thoughts. How worried are you about the threat of sort of populists using this as an opportunity to sort of say that sovereignty exists very much at the nation state level, and that is the only way that we can ever survive politically? And does the Commission have a message, one that can really resonate to people that might be flirting with these types of ideas and might even think that this is the way forward, that actually multilateralism is the thing that actually won't survive this crisis?
Yes, I think that in this crisis we are experiencing a few things that are extremely European. One is very different things. One is the European Central Bank, that is extremely European, one of the few federal, so to say, institutions that we have, and its contribution in this crisis is clear. But in totally other side, we can look to, for example, how we are capable to maintain our single market, and even the movement of essential goods, even in a situation where the pressure to close borders is everywhere. Or how important is our model of welfare state and public healthcare, which is strictly connected to European society's model, and then in this very dangerous situation is showing also its strength. Then we know that there is also a lot of space for nationalism and anti-European positions in this moment, because it is unfortunately a sad tradition in Europe in moment of crisis to not only beggar your neighbor, but beggar Europe and say, okay, we can solve our problem in our national borders. I am also aware of the fact that the arguments fueling this kind of nationalism and anti-European positions are very different from country to country. And in some cases, they are opposite. So the anti-European positions in France and in Italy are fueled by completely different arguments that anti-European positions in Germany or in the Netherlands. And this is a reason for working together, the pro-European responsible governments and political parties, because even despite the fact that they have different arguments, they are all targeting the European project, and we have to save this European project, overcoming differences among our countries and governments. So, grazie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We wish you a very lot of success in the upcoming crucial meetings, because we do need a strong European fiscal response so as to minimize the hardship on citizens across Europe. And I hope you enjoyed listening to our podcast and live event with the Financial Times, Marine Khan, Commissioner Gentiloni. Thank you very much. Until next time, bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.